September 11th, 1697. The Tisza River runs crimson with the blood of 30,000 men. In less than 2 hours, one of history's most devastating military catastrophes will unfold on these muddy banks. The screams of the dying will echo across the Balkans for generations. This is the story of how a single morning shattered an empire's dreams of conquest and left the Ottoman army drowning in its own ambition. This is Zenta, and what happened here was nothing short of a massacre. To understand the horror that unfolded at Zenta, we must first journey back to the dying days of Ottoman supremacy in Europe. For nearly 3 centuries, the crescent banner had cast its shadow across the Balkans, reaching the very gates of Vienna itself. The Ottoman Empire, once an unstoppable force that sent Christian Europe into fits of terror, was now showing cracks in its seemingly impenetrable armor. The year was 1683, when Sultan Mehmed IV made his most ambitious gamble. 200,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded Vienna, the jewel of the Habsburg Empire. For 2 months, the city held its breath as Turkish sappers tunneled beneath its walls and massive cannons pounded its defenses day and night. The people of Vienna could hear the enemy digging beneath their feet, could smell the gunpowder smoke that choked the air, could see their supplies dwindling to nothing. Death seemed inevitable. But then came the miracle. On September 12th, King Jan Sobieski of Poland arrived with the largest cavalry charge in history. 18,000 horsemen thundered down the slopes of Kahlenberg Mountain like an avalanche of steel and fury. The Ottoman lines shattered, the siege broke, and the tide of history turned forever. What followed was 14 years of brutal, grinding warfare. The Great Turkish War, as it came to be known, saw the Holy League, a coalition of Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, slowly pushing the Ottomans back across the Balkans. City after city fell. Belgrade, that ancient fortress that had guarded the Ottoman frontier for generations, surrendered to imperial forces. The Hungarian plain, occupied by Turkish soldiers for over a century, was being liberated piece by bloody piece. By 1697, Sultan Mustafa II knew his empire stood at a crossroads. The shame of continuous defeats weighed heavily on the Ottoman court. Whispers of weakness echoed through the halls of the Topkapi Palace. The Janissaries, once the most feared infantry in the world, grumbled about incompetent leadership. The Sultan needed a victory, not just any victory, but a triumph so complete, so devastating to the Christian forces that it would restore Ottoman prestige and reverse the terrible momentum of war. Mustafa decided to lead the army himself. It was a decision born of desperation and pride in equal measure. Throughout the summer of 1697, he assembled a massive force. Contemporary sources speak of an army numbering over 100,000 men, though the exact figures remain debated by historians. What is certain is that this represented one of the largest military concentrations the Ottoman Empire could muster at this late stage of the war. The Sultan's target was clear: the Kingdom of Hungary. If he could strike a decisive blow against the Habsburgs here, if he could recapture lost territories and shatter the Holy League's armies, then perhaps, just perhaps, the empire's fortunes could be reversed. The invasion began with high hopes. Ottoman forces crossed the Sava River and pushed northward through the scorching summer heat. But the campaign quickly turned sour. The imperial forces, under the command of various generals, refused to give battle on the Sultan's terms. They retreated, they harassed, they burned the countryside rather than let it feed the Ottoman army. The Turkish soldiers found themselves marching through devastated lands, where every well had been poisoned and every granary emptied. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Disease began to spread through the camps. Men died not from Austrian bullets, but from dysentery and typhus. By early September, Mustafa's grand offensive had stalled completely. The army had captured a few minor fortresses, but achieved nothing of strategic significance. Worse still, autumn was approaching. Soon the rains would turn the roads to mud, and winter would make campaigning impossible. The Sultan faced a bitter choice: continue pushing forward into increasingly hostile territory with a weakening army, or retreat back across the rivers and admit failure. He chose retreat. But this decision, made with reluctance in the Sultan's ornate command tent, would lead directly to the catastrophe that awaited at Zenta. While Mustafa struggled with his faltering campaign, the Holy League had found its champion. Prince Eugene of Savoy was not yet the legendary military genius he would become, but at 34 years old, he had already proven himself a commander of exceptional skill and daring. Born in Paris, rejected for military service by Louis XIV, Eugene had found his calling in imperial service. He possessed a mind that could read terrain like poetry and anticipate enemy movements with uncanny precision. More importantly, Eugene understood something fundamental about warfare that many of his contemporaries did not. Speed and aggression could defeat superior numbers. While other generals of his era preferred careful, methodical campaigns, Eugene embraced risk. He marched his armies faster than anyone thought possible. He attacked when conventional wisdom demanded caution, and he had an almost supernatural ability to appear where his enemies least expected him. In late August of 1697, Eugene received reports that the Ottoman army was beginning its withdrawal. His scouts, Hungarian hussars who knew every path and ford in this country, brought him detailed intelligence. The Sultan's forces were moving south toward the Tisza River, one of the major waterways that crossed the Hungarian plain. They would need to cross this river to reach safety, and crossing a river with a massive army was always a moment of terrible vulnerability. Eugene saw his opportunity immediately. If he could catch the Ottomans in the act of crossing, if he could strike while their forces were divided by the water, he could inflict devastating damage. But timing would be everything. Move too soon and the enemy would detect the threat and choose a different crossing point. Move too late and they would already be safely across. The prince made his decision with characteristic boldness. He would pursue the Ottoman army with all possible speed and force them into battle wherever he could catch them. On September 7th, Eugene's army began its rapid march south. He drove his men hard, covering distances that would have been considered impossible for an army of that era. Soldiers marched through the night, catching a few hours of sleep before dawn and then moving again. The baggage trains struggled to keep up, but Eugene kept pushing. His army was significantly smaller than the Sultan's force. Eugene commanded perhaps 50 to 55,000 men, depending on which historical account you believe. Against an Ottoman force of over 100,000, the numbers seemed impossibly against him. But Eugene was counting on surprise, superior positioning, and the chaos that would result from catching an army mid-river crossing. September 11th dawned with a heavy mist rising from the Tisza River. The Ottoman army had reached the crossing point near the town of Zenta the previous evening. The Sultan's engineers had immediately begun constructing a pontoon bridge, a floating roadway made of boats lashed together and covered with wooden planks. This was an enormous undertaking. The Tisza, swollen from late summer rains, ran wide and fast at this point. Building a bridge strong enough to carry artillery, cavalry, and tens of thousands of infantry required time, materials, and uninterrupted work. Mustafa's commanders had chosen the crossing point carefully. The northern bank, where the Ottoman army currently waited, offered relatively open ground. The southern bank rose slightly higher, providing a good defensive position for any forces that crossed first. The plan was simple. Establish a strong bridgehead on the southern bank, then move the main army across in an orderly fashion. But there was a fatal flaw in this plan. The Ottoman scouts had failed to detect Eugene's approach. Whether through overconfidence, incompetence, or simply bad luck, the Turkish reconnaissance forces had not ranged far north enough to spot the imperial army's rapid advance. The Sultan and his commanders believed they had time. They were catastrophically wrong. Eugene's hussars reached the area around Zenta on the morning of September 11th. What they saw must have seemed like a gift from God himself. The Ottoman army was spread out along the northern bank of the Tisza River, completely unprepared for battle. Thousands of soldiers had already crossed to the southern bank, but the vast majority of the Turkish force remained on the northern side, waiting their turn to use the single pontoon bridge. The army was caught in the most vulnerable position imaginable. They couldn't retreat northward without abandoning their crossing entirely. They couldn't quickly cross to the southern bank because the bridge could only accommodate a small number of troops at a time. And they were strung out along several miles of riverbank, making coordinated defense nearly impossible. When Eugene received this intelligence, he didn't hesitate for a moment. He immediately ordered his entire army to deploy for battle. Every officer knew what was at stake. They had to attack now, before the Ottomans could react, before they could form proper defensive lines, before they could get more forces across the river. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, and Eugene intended to seize it with both hands. The imperial army advanced in three main columns. On the right wing, cavalry under Count Guido Starhemberg would sweep around to cut off any retreat. In the center, the main infantry force, supported by artillery, would smash directly into the Ottoman lines. On the left, more cavalry would prevent any reinforcements from the southern bank from crossing back to help their trapped comrades. As the Austrian forces emerged from the morning mist, the Ottoman sentries finally raised the alarm. Panic rippled through the Turkish camps. Officers shouted contradictory orders, soldiers grabbed weapons and tried to form ranks, but there hadn't been time to prepare proper defensive positions. The Sultan himself was reportedly caught completely off guard, having just finished his midday prayers. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most one-sided slaughters in military history. The imperial artillery opened fire first. Cannonballs screamed across the flat ground and plowed bloody furrows through the packed Ottoman ranks. Men simply disappeared in explosions of red mist. Severed limbs flew through the air. The wounded screamed in agony as they were trampled by their own comrades trying to escape the bombardment. The Ottoman forces attempted to form defensive lines, and to their credit, many units fought with desperate courage. The Janissaries, those elite soldiers who had terrified Europe for centuries, stood their ground and returned fire with their muskets. Turkish artillery crews tried to bring their own guns to bear, but Eugene's rapid assault had caught them before they could properly deploy. Then came the cavalry charge. Thousands of imperial horsemen thundered into the Ottoman flanks like a hammer striking an anvil. The Turkish forces, compressed between the river behind them and the attacking Europeans before them, had nowhere to maneuver. Cavalry warfare at this time was brutally intimate. Sabers rose and fell, splitting skulls and severing necks. Horses trampled fallen men into the mud. The screaming was indescribable. The Ottoman army began to break. First one unit, then another, then entire regiments threw down their weapons and tried to flee. But where could they go? Behind them was the Tisza, its waters running swift and cold. The single pontoon bridge became a death trap as thousands of panicked soldiers tried to cross simultaneously. The bridge, never designed for such weight and chaos, began to sway dangerously. Then it collapsed. Eyewitness accounts describe the horrifying moment when the pontoon bridge broke apart under the weight of desperate men. Hundreds of soldiers, many in heavy armor, plunged into the river. The Tisza River, they say, ran red for 3 days. On the northern bank, the massacre intensified. With escape cut off, some Ottoman soldiers fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. Others simply knelt and awaited death, murmuring final prayers. The imperial soldiers, their blood up and knowing they had the enemy completely at their mercy, showed little quarter. Swords and pikes did their terrible work. The ground became so slippery with blood that men lost their footing and fell into the gore. The Sultan himself barely escaped. As his bodyguard fought a desperate rearguard action, Mustafa was hustled onto a horse and driven toward the river. According to some accounts, he swam his horse across the Tisza, nearly drowning in the attempt. Other sources suggest he found a small boat. Regardless of the exact method, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the shadow of God on earth, fled the battlefield in disgrace, abandoning tens of thousands of his soldiers to their fate. The battle lasted approximately 2 hours, from the first cannon shot to the final collapse of Ottoman resistance, but the killing continued much longer. As darkness fell on September 11th, imperial soldiers moved through the carnage, finishing off the wounded and collecting valuables from the dead. The moans of dying men filled the night air. The Tisza River, they say, ran red for 3 days. When dawn broke on September 12th, the true scale of the catastrophe became apparent. The northern bank of the Tisza looked like a vision of hell itself. Bodies lay in heaps, sometimes piled 3 or 4 deep where the Ottoman soldiers had made their final stands. The ground was no longer visible beneath the carpet of corpses. Weapons, armor, banners, and personal belongings lay scattered across miles of blood-soaked earth. Prince Eugene ordered his men to begin counting the dead. It was a task that took days. Contemporary Christian sources claim that over 25,000 Ottoman soldiers died at Zenta, with some estimates reaching as high as 30,000. Even if we treat these numbers with historical skepticism, understanding that victors often inflate enemy casualties, the loss was staggering. Modern historians generally accept that between 20,000 and 30,000 Ottoman soldiers perished in those 2 terrible hours. But numbers alone cannot capture the totality of the disaster. The Ottoman Empire lost not just men, but critical military leadership. Dozens of senior commanders died at Zenta, their bodies later identified by their ornate armor and clothing. The Grand Vizier himself, Elmas Mehmed Pasha, was killed leading a desperate counterattack. His severed head was later presented to Eugene as a trophy. The loss of experienced officers would cripple Ottoman military effectiveness for years to come. The material losses were equally catastrophic. The imperial forces captured the entire Ottoman artillery trade, over 100 cannons that represented a massive investment in bronze, iron, and manufacturing expertise. They seized the Sultan's personal baggage, including his treasure chest, his ceremonial tent worth a fortune in silk and gold thread, and his personal seal. They captured supply wagons filled with gunpowder, musket balls, food, and equipment. Everything the Ottoman army needed to campaign was lost. Perhaps most symbolically devastating was the capture of the Sultan's harem. In Ottoman culture, the Sultan's women were sacred, their seclusion absolute. Yet at Zenta, in the chaos of retreat, the imperial household guards had abandoned their posts. Habsburg soldiers discovered the Sultan's wives and concubines in their carriages, unveiled and unprotected. This violation, this exposure of the most private aspect of the Sultan's life, was seen across the Islamic world as a profound humiliation. Eugene's own losses were remarkably light. Depending on the source, imperial casualties ranged from approximately 300 to perhaps 2,000 killed and wounded. Even taking the highest estimate, the exchange rate was utterly lopsided. For every Christian soldier who fell, 10 or 15 Ottoman soldiers died. As military engagements go, Zenta was not a battle, it was an execution. News of the disaster traveled slowly in that age before telegraphs or telephones, but when it reached Constantinople, the reaction was explosive. The Ottoman capital descended into chaos. Riots broke out in the streets as soldiers and civilians demanded answers. How could the invincible Ottoman army, the force that had conquered Constantinople itself, that had threatened the heart of Europe, suffer such a comprehensive defeat? The Janissaries, already resentful of Sultan Mustafa's leadership, openly mutinied. These elite soldiers, who could make or break sultans, gathered in threatening crowds before the palace gates. They demanded the heads of the commanders they blamed for Zenta. They questioned whether Mustafa himself was fit to rule. The Sultan, still traumatized from his narrow escape at the river, found himself a virtual prisoner in his own palace, dependent on loyal guards to protect him from his own military. Across the empire, the defeat sent shockwaves. Ottoman governors in distant provinces wondered if the center could hold. Subject peoples, the Christians of the Balkans who had lived under Ottoman rule for generations, sensed weakness and began to stir. The Venetians, sensing opportunity, intensified their campaigns in Greece. The Russians increased pressure on Ottoman positions around the Black Sea. Perhaps most tellingly, the financial impact was immediate and severe. The Ottoman economy, already strained by years of warfare, reeled from the loss of so much military equipment and treasure. The silver and gold captured at Zenta represented wealth that could have paid soldiers, bought supplies, and maintained the empire's military infrastructure for months. Now it lined Habsburg coffers instead. Sultan Mustafa attempted to salvage something from the disaster. He ordered his surviving forces to regroup and prepare for a renewed campaign the following spring. But the orders rang hollow. The army that limped back to Ottoman territory was a broken force. Soldiers deserted by the thousands. Officers who had survived Zenta were too traumatized or too ashamed to effectively command. The Sultan's own authority had been shattered along with his army on the banks of the Tisza. The Battle of Zenta effectively ended the Great Turkish War, though fighting would sputter on for another year. The Ottoman Empire, facing military collapse, economic crisis, and internal instability, had no choice but to sue for peace. Negotiations began in late 1697 and culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz in January 1699. The terms were humiliating for the once mighty empire. The Ottomans ceded almost all of Hungary to the Habsburgs, territory they had controlled for over 150 years. Transylvania became an Austrian protectorate. The Venetians gained significant territories in Greece and Dalmatia. Even the Poles, who had been relatively minor players in the later stages of the war, received some territorial concessions. But the true significance of Karlowitz went far beyond borders on a map. For the first time in Ottoman history, the empire signed a peace treaty not as an equal, but as a defeated power. Previous agreements with European states had been framed as temporary truces granted by the magnanimous Sultan. Karlowitz was different. This was a victor's peace, dictated by Christian powers to a humbled Islamic empire. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 3 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the aggressor in Europe, the expanding power that forced Christian states onto the defensive. After Karlowitz, that dynamic permanently reversed. The empire that had conquered Constantinople, that had ruled the Balkans, that had twice besieged Vienna, would never again threaten Central Europe. The age of Ottoman expansion was over. Historians mark the Treaty of Karlowitz as the beginning of the empire's long decline, a process that would culminate in its complete collapse after World War I, over 200 years later. But the seeds of that decline were planted in the mud and blood of Zenta. For Prince Eugene of Savoy, Zenta was the making of his legend. The victory elevated him to the front rank of European military commanders. He would go on to win further triumphs against both the Ottomans and the French, cementing his reputation as one of the greatest generals of his age. His campaigns would be studied in military academies for centuries. But Zenta remained his most dramatic achievement. The sheer audacity of the operation, the perfection of the timing, the completeness of the victory, all combined to create a masterpiece of military art. Eugene had demonstrated principles that would influence warfare for generations: the value of rapid movement, the importance of accurate intelligence, the devastating effectiveness of catching an enemy in a vulnerable position, and the psychological impact of overwhelming victory. In Vienna, Eugene was celebrated as the savior of Christendom. Poems were written in his honor. Medals were struck bearing his likeness. The Habsburg emperor showered him with honors, estates, and positions of power. Churches across Catholic Europe held special masses, thanking God for the deliverance at Zenta. In the propaganda of the era, Eugene became a new crusader, a Christian knight who had struck down the infidel horde. The prince himself remained remarkably modest about his achievement. In his correspondence, he attributed the victory to the courage of his soldiers, the quality of his officers, and divine providence. But privately, he must have known the truth. Zenta was a result of superior generalship, plain and simple. He had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought an enemy that possessed superior numbers. He had turned the science of war into an art form. Yet beneath the celebrations and the grand historical significance, we must not forget the human reality of Zenta. 30,000 men died on that September day. 30,000 individuals, each with their own stories, their own hopes, their own families waiting for them to return home. The Ottoman soldiers who perished at Zenta came from across a vast empire. There were Turks from Anatolia, Arabs from Syria and Egypt, Albanians from the mountains, Kurds from the eastern provinces. Many were professional soldiers, janissaries, and cavalry who had chosen military service as their life's path. But many more were conscripts, farmers and artisans pulled from their homes to serve the Sultan, men who had never wanted to be soldiers at all. The letters that survive from this period, the personal accounts and memoirs, give us glimpses of these individual tragedies. A mother in Damascus who waited in vain for her son to return. A wife in Edirne who received news that her husband had drowned in the Tisza, his body never recovered. A father who learned that his 3 sons had all fallen in the same battle, ending his family line forever. On the Christian side, too, there were costs. The Habsburg soldiers who fought at Zenta were not immune to death. Musket balls and Ottoman sabers claimed their share of lives. Families in Austria, Croatia, and Germany mourned their losses just as Ottoman families did. War, no matter how one-sided the victory, always demands its price in blood. And then there were the civilians caught in the path of the campaign, the Hungarian peasants whose villages were burned to deny supplies to the Ottoman army, the Serbian Orthodox Christians who lived in territories that changed hands multiple times, never knowing if the next soldiers to arrive would be protectors or plunderers. The countless unnamed people displaced by the war, forced to flee their homes and become refugees in a violent, uncertain world. The Battle of Zenta resonated through European history in ways both obvious and subtle. Most immediately, it confirmed the Habsburg position as the dominant power in Central Europe. The territories gained at Karlowitz would form the basis for the Austro-Hungarian Empire that would exist until 1918. Vienna, which had been a frontier city threatened by Ottoman invasion, became the glittering capital of a great power. For the Ottoman Empire, Zenta marked the beginning of a long, painful period of reform and decline. Subsequent sultans would attempt to modernize the military, to adopt European tactics and technologies, to reverse the empire's strategic weakness. Some of these reforms succeeded, at least temporarily. Others failed spectacularly. But the empire would never again achieve the power and prestige it had commanded before that terrible day at the Tisza River. The battle also had profound cultural impacts. In European literature and art, Zenta became a symbol of Christian triumph over Islam. Paintings depicted the moment of Eugene's victory, usually with considerable artistic license. Epic poems recounted the battle, transforming it into a mythic confrontation between good and evil, civilization and barbarism. This cultural narrative, however inaccurate and prejudiced, influenced European attitudes toward the Ottoman Empire and Islam more broadly for generations. In the Ottoman Empire and the wider Islamic world, Zenta was remembered differently, when it was remembered at all. It became a symbol of the need for military reform, of the dangers of complacency, of the importance of adapting to changing circumstances. Ottoman military theorists in the 18th century would point to Zenta as an example of what happened when traditional methods met modern warfare. The site of the battle itself, near the town now called Senta in modern Serbia, became a place of historical pilgrimage. Over the centuries, various monuments were erected to commemorate the event. The local population, ethnically mixed and religiously diverse, held complex and sometimes contradictory views about the battle. For some, it represented liberation from Ottoman rule. For others, it was a reminder of tragedy and loss. Military historians have studied Zenta for over 3 centuries, and the battle continues to offer lessons relevant even in modern warfare. Eugene's victory demonstrated that superior numbers mean nothing if an army cannot effectively deploy those numbers. The Ottoman force at Zenta was larger and potentially more powerful, but caught in an impossible tactical situation, those advantages became meaningless. The battle also illustrated the critical importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. The Ottoman failure to detect Eugene's approach was not simply bad luck. It reflected a systematic weakness in their scouting and intelligence gathering. In contrast, Eugene's Hungarian hussars provided him with timely, accurate information that allowed him to exploit the enemy's vulnerability. In warfare, knowing where your enemy is and what he is doing can be more valuable than an extra 10,000 soldiers. Timing was another crucial factor. Eugene's decision to attack immediately, without waiting to rest his troops or gather more forces, proved exactly correct. Had he delayed even 12 hours, the Ottomans might have completed their river crossing and escaped the trap. The prince understood that in war, opportunities are fleeting. Hesitation can turn potential victory into missed chance. The psychological dimension of Zenta was equally significant. The sheer completeness of the Ottoman defeat, the capture of the Sultan's personal belongings, the spectacle of thousands drowning in the river, all combined to create a psychological shock that reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Ottoman morale never fully recovered. Soldiers who survived Zenta carried the trauma with them, and that trauma infected the entire military system. As we step back from the immediate horror and drama of Zenta, we can see its place in the broader sweep of history. The battle was not an isolated incident, but rather a culmination of forces that had been building for decades. The Ottoman Empire's institutional problems, its difficulty adapting to military innovations, its internal political struggles, all contributed to making the disaster possible. Conversely, the Habsburg victory was not simply a matter of Eugene's genius, though his leadership was crucial. It reflected the growing military and economic power of European states, their increasing technological sophistication, their developing systems of warfare that emphasized disciplined infantry, mobile artillery, and coordinated combined arms operations. In this sense, Zenta was a collision between two different military systems, two different political structures, two different eras. The Ottoman way of war, based on cavalry dominance, elite infantry like the Janissaries, and the Sultan's personal leadership, was meeting its match against European methods that emphasized firepower, engineering, and professional officer corps. The older system, for all its past glories, was losing to the new. Yet we must be careful not to adopt a deterministic view of history. Zenta was not inevitable. With different leadership, better reconnaissance, or simply a different crossing point, the Ottoman army might have escaped intact. The course of history might have been altered. This is both the tragedy and the fascination of studying such moments. They are hinge points where individual decisions and chance events combine to shape the future of nations and empires. The 30,000 dead at Zenta did not die to fulfill some predetermined historical pattern. They died because of specific choices made by specific individuals on specific days. Sultan Mustafa's decision to campaign in 1697, his choice of withdrawal route, the Ottoman commander's failure to establish adequate security, Eugene's bold pursuit, the timing of his attack. Each of these decisions, made by mortal men acting with imperfect information and human limitations, contributed to the final result. Today, if you visit the Tisza River near Zenta, you will find a peaceful landscape. Fields stretch away from the riverbanks. The water flows gently through the Serbian countryside. There is no sign of the carnage that once stained these grounds. Nature has long since erased the physical evidence of that September day in 1697. But history remembers. The Battle of Zenta stands as one of the most decisive engagements of the early modern era, a turning point that marked the end of Ottoman expansion into Europe and the beginning of Habsburg dominance in Central Europe. It demonstrated that empires, no matter how powerful they may seem, are vulnerable. That military might, if poorly led and inadequately employed, can be shattered in a matter of hours. That the course of history can change in the time it takes for a pontoon bridge to collapse. For the Ottoman Empire, Zenta was the beginning of the end, the first step on a long road that would eventually lead to dissolution and collapse. For Europe, it was a moment of deliverance, a victory that secured Central Europe from Islamic conquest and allowed the development of the political and cultural systems that would define the continent for centuries to come. But perhaps most importantly, Zenta reminds us of war's terrible cost. 30,000 lives ended in those 2 hours of slaughter. 30,000 futures erased. Uncountable families destroyed. Cities and villages across 2 empires plunged into mourning. Behind the grand strategies and the historical significance, behind the celebration of military genius and the mourning of imperial decline, there lies this simple, terrible truth. War, even victorious war, even necessary war, devours human lives without mercy. The Tisza River flows on, as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia to come. But on September 11, 1697, its waters turned red with the blood of a generation. And in that crimson tide, the fate of empires was written. The screams have long since faded, the bodies have long since returned to dust, but the Battle of Zenta, that surprise assault that shook the Balkans and crushed Ottoman expansion, echoes still through the corridors of history, a reminder of both human courage and human tragedy, of brilliant strategy and terrible cost, of the day when an empire's dreams drowned in a Hungarian river.